Just wanted to start with a little bit of a tech warning and explain the Q&A system. Don't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar, so you'll only be able to see the panelists, even though we can't see you. There's no chat, but there is a Q&A function. Feel welcome to type in any questions. We'll see them. We can answer them through text or openly. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, so that's when we'll answer all of your questions. Also, I have put in the link for CLE accreditation. This is a CLE accredited panel, so anyone looking to get credits, all the information is posted in the Google document that I posted. You'll also see information there in how to donate to Friends of Land, Air, Water. If you donate to FLA, then you will be funding students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships over the summer. So that's a really important source of funding for us. With that, welcome to this PILC panel. My name is Kieran Gay. With Land, Air, Water, I am the WALU apprentice, so I work on our annual zine as well as hosting panels. And with me today, I have Paige Corich-Kleim from No More Deaths. So No More Deaths, or No Más Muertes, is an organization that is dedicated to upholding fundamental human rights at and near the U.S.-Mexico border. No More Deaths workers and volunteers conduct year-round humanitarian missions supplying food, water, and health supplies to individuals in distress. The organization also documents incidents of abuse and conduct search parties for people who have gone missing while under the custody of U.S. Border Patrol. Now I will be handing the panel over to her so she can start her presentation. Thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you so much, Kieran. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, does that look good, Kieran?
Looks great.
Okay, cool. So my name is Paige Corich-Kleim. I am a volunteer with No More Deaths. The name of this panel is Human Rights at the U.S.-Mexico Border. I am going to give a pretty broad and wide overview of many things. It's kind of a mile wide, inch deep approach. So please be patient with me. There's definitely many more details I could share about any of the topics that we'll discuss, but I wanted to give like a really broad overview. So we're going to start by talking really briefly about the border crisis and current border militarization. And then we'll talk about the work of No More Deaths and kind of how we've responded to the border and this crisis. After that, we're going to, I'm going to get into the criminalization of humanitarian aid. No More Deaths has faced criminal charges over the years of our existence. So I'm going to talk a bit about what those charges were, how they came about, and how we fought them. I guess a little spoiler alert, we currently have no pending charges and haven't been found guilty of anything. So that's an exciting thing. We'll also talk about sort of some recent updates, how COVID has affected our work, as well as the shift in administration, and then how you can support our work. And then we'll end with a Q&A. So again, very, very broad. Any of these topics I think could be their own like multi-part webinar, but I'm gonna try to just cover as much information as possible. And if, I think Kieran's watching the Q&A, so if I say something that's unclear, let me know and I can, just kind of go a little deeper into that. Otherwise, we'll hold Q&A until the end. Okay, so to kind of start with talking about the border, we can't talk about the border without talking about the fact that North America, South America, all of this land is colonized indigenous land. The area that we do most of our work is Tana Atam or Hiachet Atam land, as well as Yaqui land. If you're watching this from Eugene, Oregon, I went to school there and I know y'all are on Kalapuya land. But it's important to, when we talk about migration and borders, we need to recognize that migration is something that has happened on this land since time immemorial. People have moved north and south, crossing what are now militarized borders for a really long time. On the right side, you can see a picture of where we work, and they're all traditional Atam lands. It just says Tana Atam, but actually it's also Hyachar Atam, which is a federal a group that's not recognized by the federal government, but a lot of that land is Hyachar Atam. And people traditionally have migrated from the northern area of their homelands, which is the Gila River, all the way down to the Sea of Cortez. There's been a lot of migration north and south. I'm not going to go into the history of westward expansion and the establishment of the border. I'm going to kind of skip over that and go from since time immemorial all the way to my slide is not moving, to 1994. For most of the history of the United States, the border was not really enforced. The U.S. Border Patrol wasn't even established until 1924, and they were a pretty small agency for most of their existence. That all changed in 1994 when they established the border enforcement policy of prevention through deterrence. This strategy didn't look to wall off and seal the entire border. It looked to wall off and heavily enforce urban areas, which were traditional crossing areas, and actively funnel people into remote and desolate terrain. And so on the left, you can see that's a picture of the border between San Diego and Tijuana. On the left is TJ, and on the right is San Diego. And that area actually has a double wall and this kind of little no man's land. But basically, prevention through deterrence cut off traditional routes and actively funneled people into areas that look a lot more like what you see on the right-hand side. Open, vast, desolate, desert terrain. And this was done with the explicit intention of making border crossing more violent, making it so that people would suffer, potentially die, potentially disappear. And eventually that information would get back to their sending communities and people would stop coming. It's also been referred to as deterrence by death. This was also the same year, 1994, that the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was established, which many people say destabilized the Mexican agrarian economy by having this free trade agreement that flooded the market with subsidized US corn, among other things. And so US foreign policy kind of worked hand in hand with border enforcement policy. So obviously this strategy did not stop migration. What it did do, though, is result in a huge increase in death and suffering and disappearance. So this is a map of the known migrant deaths in southern Arizona from 1994 until 2020. There also, I didn't update this, but I know that so far this year in 2021, there have been about 16 known migrant deaths in Arizona that aren't reflected on this map. But each red dot on here is one or more known migrant deaths. And we say known migrant deaths because the actual level of suffering is pretty much unknowable, partially because of how vast these areas are, but also because of the tracking systems that different counties have. So migrant deaths are tracked at the county level. And if you look on the left-hand side of this map, you can see a town called Dateland, and there's a pretty direct line that you can see where there's a ton of red dots, and then to the left, south of Dateland, there's only 2. And the reason for that is that that is the county line. That the county to the west of that area is called Yuma County, and they don't have a consistent tracking method for migrant deaths. We've reached out to them to try to change that, but essentially they're just not, they're not categorizing people as potentially border crossers, and they're not counting them. So there's a lot of issues with those tracking systems, and I think it reflects a lot of the way that the U.S. has dealt with this crisis in general. So when those deaths started increasing, there was obviously a community response from border residents who had people crossing and showing up at their back doors and asking for food and water, but also from community organizations. And so there were a few groups, Humane Borders, La Coalición de Derechos Humanos, and the Samaritans that popped up. in the late 90s, early aughts. And then No More Deaths, my organization was started in 2004. And most of these deaths in the desert are caused by extreme heat, hyperthermia, and also hypothermia in the winters. And so, and a lot of it, kind of caused by dehydration and the really extreme heat in the desert. A lot of these areas, the summertime highs will get up to 120 degrees and there's no natural water sources. And so all of these organizations came together and started putting out water and different supplies. And so that's a lot of what we do as an organization. We walk migrant trails, we map different areas based on the maps of known deaths, and we put out water, as well as people also need calories if they're going that distance. So we put out beans and different snacks that have like easy open cans and buckets with food. In the winters, we also put out blankets and clean socks and different supplies like that. We also operate humanitarian aid stations. These are some pictures of our main aid station, which is called Bird Camp. It's near a small town called Aravaca. And essentially what we do in these locations is we provide first aid to people who are crossing through the area. Bird Camp is in a really strategic location. It's in kind of this valley where there's 3 or 4 washes or dry riverbeds that converge right next to the camp. And so people who are lost and walking out of the mountains will often be funneled right to where we're set up. And we have big flags and signs saying like, hey, you can come get help here. And we provide first aid to people. Most of what we see is really, it kind of depends on the weather and what time of year it is. In the summer, we see a lot of dehydration. We see a lot of gastrointestinal issues. A lot of this area is ranching land, and so there's no natural water, but there are cattle ponds that are pretty filthy, but it's the only water around, so people end up drinking contaminated water. So we often see a lot of like diarrhea and vomiting. We also see really intense blisters and foot issues, or different kind of traumatic injuries, like people taking falls in the mountains and things like that. Sometimes we also see rattlesnake bites, especially in the summer. This winter has been pretty intense and cold, and a couple of weeks ago we had about 4 inches of snow at our aid station. And so I want to just kind of reiterate that it's not just the heat that really can injure people, it's also the cold. And so we're set up with tents and places for people to rest in those spaces. We also do work in northern Mexico. And we kind of divide it into post-deportation support. So helping people who have just been dropped off by Border Patrol or by ICE by making phone calls or helping them get their belongings. And we also do pre-departure support. So we distribute harm reduction kits and information to people at different shelters that we have relationships with in northern Mexico. And the goal of this is kind of just harm reduction, making sure people kind of understand what the terrain might look like, and then giving people tips on how to self-rescue and get help if they need it. In those spaces, we also distribute non-governmental emergency numbers. In the borderlands, the 911 system is, for undocumented people, is pretty discriminatory. If people call 911 and they're speaking Spanish, they get automatically transferred to Border Patrol. And often those calls drop on the transfer, and Border Patrol as an enforcement agency, they don't prioritize those phone calls. And so there's been also a big movement of non-governmental search and rescue groups in the borderlands. No More Deaths has a hotline that we run, as well as a search and rescue and recovery group. And I'll talk a bit more about that when I talk about our abuse documentation, because we actually just published a report that details the 911 system, as well as Border Patrol's lack of emergency response for undocumented people. So for our abuse documentation, basically, as soon as we started doing work, especially in northern Mexico, as well as in the field at our aid stations, we just started consistently hearing really horrific stories of abuse within Border Patrol, short-term custody, and ICE custody. as well as Border Patrol tactics in the field. And so we started documenting these abuses and publishing reports on them. And our first one on the left was Crossing the Line, and we published that in 2008. Then we published A Culture of Cruelty and Shakedown. And then our current project is called Disappeared, How the U.S. Border Enforcement Agencies Are Fueling a Missing Persons Crisis. And Disappeared is it's a 3-part series that I'll share a few more details on when we get further into the presentation. But it's a pretty amazing report, and I definitely encourage people to read more about it, because I think a lot of the information it's all based on firsthand accounts of and stories that are happening in the borderlands. But our abuse documentation has been a really important advocacy tool for us. We don't, as an org, we don't necessarily do a lot of lobbying and advocacy ourselves, like in DC, because we just don't have the capacity to, but we kind of see it as a strategic role for us to at least document these abuses and create the resources for other people to kind of validate and legitimize their work and just support in that way. We also have a legal clinic called Keep Tucson Together, where we provide free legal services for Tucson residents that need help with either becoming a citizen, applying for asylum. We also do a lot of DACA work, so helping people with the process for deferred action for childhood arrivals. And then we were doing a lot of anti-deportation work in the Obama years that had to shift a lot during the Trump administration, but we'll see how Biden deals with immigration enforcement priorities, and that work might shift. So we'll just kind of see how that goes. But I think a cool thing that I like about No More Deaths is we're a pretty responsive organization. And so we kind of look at what's happening and try to figure out how we can intervene. And so, trying to be out in the desert where people need us, but also seeing that we can talk to people and meet people in northern Mexico and kind of intervene in that way as well. But we're always kind of shifting our work just to be as effective as possible, because our mission is so wide. All right, so that's a really brief overview of our work. I encourage people to check out our website at nomoredeaths.org, and at the end I'll put all of our social media and information up, but that's an extremely abridged version of some of our main projects. So now I'm going to hop into kind of the bulk of this presentation, which is going to talk about the criminalization of No More Deaths volunteers. And I'm going to start by just kind of putting these first two things on a timeline up here. This is a timeline from 2017 to about 2019. And there's going to be a lot of information. There's overlapping court timelines, there's overlapping defendants, overlapping judges. It's kind of a lot of information, but the main thing to know is that over the past 5 years, we've had a bunch of volunteers face criminal charges. 9 of those volunteers faced misdemeanor charges for leaving water in the desert. And then we had 1 volunteer, Dr. Scott Warren, who was charged with felony, harboring, and conspiracy for working at one of our aid stations in Ajo, Arizona. And so in 2017, we had 9 volunteers receive summons from U.S. Fish and Wildlife for leaving water in a wilderness area in the desert. And a month later, one of our volunteers was arrested along with 2 other men at one of our aid stations. And so really quickly, we went from just kind of our normal activities to being entangled in a bunch of federal charges. After that, after we had all the charges come in, we kind of launched into a year of, first we found pro bono lawyers for our volunteers. We do have a legal team, and we also found outside support just with this huge number of volunteers that were going to be on trial. So we had a ton of motions to get the charges dropped. We organized petitions and sign-ons. We had Amnesty International writing letters for us. We just kind of launched into this really big shift in our work from doing a lot of direct aid in the field to also simultaneously running a legal defense campaign. And first we had, so the 9 volunteers that had misdemeanor charges were divided into 3 distinct groups. And we referred to them collectively as the Cabeza 9 because of the area that they were charged was on the Cabeza Prieta Wildlife Refuge. And they were divided into 3 groups. There were 2 groups of 4, and then one other individual who was actually Scott Warren, who also had the felony charges. So there was 3 separate basically cases that we were fighting as an organization. So we started with a trial in January 2019 for volunteers facing a combination of different misdemeanor charges, and they were found guilty of abandonment of property and entering a wildlife refuge without a permit. We immediately appealed that, but they were initially found guilty. We had another group of 4 that had similar charges, and the government basically just said that they would drop the charges if the volunteers paid a fee. So essentially they paid a parking ticket. We said, hey, that's a win. Humanitarian aid is never a crime. And we kind of moved on from there. And then the final volunteer in the Cabeza 9 group was Dr. Scott Warren, who was also at the same time waiting for felony charges and waiting on his felony trial to happen. And he went to court in May of 2019. And he had the same judge for his misdemeanor and felony charges. And the judge, after at the end of the misdemeanor trial, it was a bench trial, so no jury. The judge said that he was going to hold off on issuing a decision until after the felony charges were resolved. And so we, went to trial, didn't get an answer, and went into Scott's first felony trial with these other pending decisions. So Scott went to court for his felony charges in June of 2019. He was charged with federal harboring and conspiracy for providing aid to 2 men in Ajo, Arizona at one of our aid stations. After about a week of trial and 3 days of deliberation, there was a hung jury. It was split 8-4, 8 for acquittal, 4 for guilty. And in July 2019, a month later, the government said that they wanted to retry Scott Warren, but this time just for the harboring charges. So they dropped the conspiracy charges. And then in November 2019, Scott went back to court for his felony charges again, just for the harboring charges. And there was another week of deliberation, a week of trial, but this time only about 3 hours of deliberation, and the jury acquitted him. And so after about 2 years of charges, we were pretty happy with that. At that point, the judge issued a decision on his misdemeanor charges. And so he went back the same day as his acquittal, and he had 2 misdemeanor charges, and one of them we had used a religious freedoms claim to defend our volunteers, and the judge basically said, yeah, for one of these charges, the religious freedom claim holds, for the other, he's guilty. And so we were at that point waiting on sentencing for him. Because the judge issued that decision on religious freedom, it actually affected the appeal of the previous volunteers. And we actually got the conviction reversed, also on the religious freedoms claim. And eventually, when Scott finally had sentencing for that guilty charge, the prosecutors actually decided to drop the charges based on the conviction reversal that had been issued by a higher court, by a judge in Tucson. That's a lot. The timeline is kind of the part that I wanted to highlight here, but now I'm going to dive a bit further into the specific charges that volunteers faced, and also some of the arguments that were used, and talk about like how we won those cases. I am not a lawyer. I'm not a law student. I was on the media team throughout these trials and read most of the briefs and was in meetings with the lawyers, but just a disclaimer that I might, I'm not a lawyer. So we're gonna start by talking about Dr. Scott Warren's felony charges. So we'll dive into the felony things first, and then we'll talk about the misdemeanor afterwards. So to talk about Scott's case, though, we have to go back to our abuse documentation work. So the Disappeared Report series, I mentioned before, it's a 3-part series on Border Patrol abuses and the crisis of disappearance in the desert. And it looks at different mechanisms of how Border Patrol causes people to die and go missing. So the first part is about deadly apprehension practices. So the practice of Border Patrol chase and scatter in the desert, and how a lot of their apprehension tactics are really violent and cause harm. Part 2 is about destruction of humanitarian aid. We often, when we go and check on our water drops, we find that they have been shot with, the water gallons themselves have been shot with guns, stabbed with knives, or vandalized in other ways. And then part 3 is about emergency non-response, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But I want to focus on the destruction of humanitarian aid piece right now. So we've been seeing destruction and vandalism for many years, but we weren't really sure who was responsible for it. And so we put out hidden trail cameras that were activated by a motion sensor. They're mostly used for hunters, but we put a bunch of those on in areas where we had seen a lot of vandalism, to try to figure out who was responsible for vandalizing our aid supplies. And this is the video that we captured from that process. And I'll just play it.
You get a good shot. Pick up this trash somebody left on the trail. It's not yours, is it? All you do is tell me, is it yours? Not yours. You're not going to tell me, huh?
All right, so I think for many of us that didn't come as much of a surprise, but did feel really validating, and we were pretty excited to release that information. We released it alongside a full report that included a GIS analysis of the area, looking at hunting seasons and different factors, to kind of make sure, even though we got video of this happening a few times, like who is the most likely actor causing the amount of vandalism that we were seeing. And we concluded that it was Border Patrol, and published our report as well as this video. And this video went viral. It was seen by millions of people around the world. And hours after it went viral is when Dr. Scott Warren was arrested. So we saw this as pretty clear retaliation. Within hours of the releasing of this video, he was arrested, which we thought was pretty suspicious. And then throughout, the process of discovery and through the motions and different hearings, it became pretty clear that Border Patrol had seen the video. We'd actually directly sent it to them just so they were aware of it, but some of the agents that also arrested Scott saw the video as well. And so we saw it as retaliation, and our work, again, just changed really quickly overnight. We had to launch a legal defense campaign, and we were also just kind of thrust into this way larger platform, and like we've became a much major player on like the international kind of humanitarian aid scene. We were getting calls and emails from around the world talking about similar things happening in Europe, and just different groups reaching out to us, which was exciting, but also pretty challenging. So again, Scott was arrested at one of our aid stations, which is, we just call it the barn. It's owned by a retired doctor in the town of Ajo, Arizona. And we provided humanitarian aid there to people crossing the desert for a couple years. But when we released the video, right after that, a couple agents set up surveillance of that space, and then conducted a knock and talk. And so they did not have a warrant. They just knocked on the door. And then they arrested Scott, Jose and Christian, who are both from Central America, and were there receiving care. Scott was held overnight and charged with felony conspiracy and harboring under the smuggling statute. Jose and Christian were held as material witnesses. They were both deposed by the government and then subsequently deported. So I want to talk a bit about the statute that Scott was charged under. So it was under the federal harboring statute, which is part of the smuggling statute. It's U.S.C. 1324. And he was charged with harboring as well as conspiracy. And so we basically, to prove that someone is guilty of harboring, the government needs to prove three things. They need to prove that the non-citizen came, entered, or remained in the US, not through an authorized port of entry. They need to prove that the defendant knew or recklessly disregarded that fact. And they need to prove that the defendant concealed, harbored, or shielded from detection the non-citizen. So the first two facts, that Jose and Christian didn't have papers, that they hadn't crossed through a port of entry, we weren't disputing that. We also weren't disputing the fact that Scott knew that. While our volunteers are not trained or technically able to do like a citizenship test, reasonably, we generally know that the people that we're supporting don't have authorization to be in the country. We're not disputing that fact. The final part is the part that we were disputing. And so that is, there's Ninth Circuit precedent that requires the government to not just prove that, to prove intention with this. So they have to prove that somebody was criminally intending to shield or conceal somebody from detection. And so that was the piece that we were trying to contest. Like, yes, they didn't have papers. Yes, we knew that. But we were offering humanitarian aid, and we view humanitarian aid as never a crime. So that was the part that we were contesting, which in the Ninth Circuit you're able to do, but that's not everywhere. So a lot of the trial was really about Scott's intentions and the intentions of the organization to conceal Jose and Christian. And that during the first trial, when there were also conspiracy charges, that process was pretty kind of wild in some ways on the part of the government. There was, I mentioned earlier that No More Deaths doesn't just work in the desert, but we also work in northern Mexico at shelters. And so kind of one of the smoking guns, I guess you could say, that the government, the prosecutors presented at one point was a video that was found on, I believe, Christian's phone of Christmas dinner at one of the shelters in northern Mexico, where there was another No More Deaths volunteer present in the video. And that was kind of the smoking gun of, oh, look, like this person has interacted with this aid organization before. And that was kind of supposedly attempted, that was part of their argument in saying that actually No More Deaths isn't a humanitarian aid organization. It's actually a binational smuggling network. And so these are a couple court sketches from the trial, but over and over again, this part just kept coming up about intentions. And if it was, the government saying that for 4 days, these illegal aliens were safe from Border Patrol, basically saying that if you put somebody inside of a building, that is concealing with criminal intent. Whereas, of course, we're saying, no, actually, look at these maps of recovered remains, this is one of the deadliest areas of the border. We're providing life-saving care to people. And so this is a quote from Scott. He says, "My intention was to provide basic humanitarian aid, relieve their suffering, and to treat them as I would any other human being who showed up on my doorstep." And so that was, I think both of these quotes are pretty indicative of how a lot of the trial went. No More Deaths and our volunteers trying to show that we're an aid group, and the government trying to prove otherwise. I do also want to mention that Scott is he has a doctoral degree. He is like a tall white man with long hair. Like, I think we all kind of joked that he looks like white Jesus. So I think whiteness and privilege played a really big role in the trial, especially to a jury. And I don't want to minimize that fact, but we were eventually able to convince a jury that that Scott's actions were well within the law and that the intentions were to provide humanitarian aid. And so here's a photo from the day of acquittal, which we were pretty excited about because it had just been such a long process. And during the first trial, he was facing about 20 years in prison, and during the second, he was facing 10. And if you looked at the original criminal complaint, the government was alleging that Scott had allowed 2 people to enter a dwelling and given them food, water, beds, and pants. And so I think we were looking at this from not just a border perspective, but also, if just allowing someone into your home and sharing food with them, this just really basic act of human kindness can be criminalized on the border. What is the implication for that in the interior of the country? Like, is this going to start being used against families who have undocumented people in their family? Is it going to be used in like social services? Like, what are the wider implications here? And so thankfully the jurors, agreed with our lawyers and found him not guilty. But it was definitely, we were pretty nervous about what the potential outcome could be if there were a guilty verdict. Again, not a lawyer, but I do want to direct people to this really great legal memorandum from the National Immigration Project. This goes into the federal offenses of harboring, transporting, smuggling, and encouraging under 1324. It's a really great primer with a bunch of case studies and information. And if people want to learn more about the smuggling statute, I encourage you to check this out, especially for more like interior, less border cases. Although I know I'm guessing they'll want to update some of it with the Warren case, but this is a great resource if people want more information. So that's kind of all I have for the felony charges. Now I'm going to go into the misdemeanor charges, and thank you all for your patience. I know there's a lot of overlapping and slightly confusing things, but hopefully by the end it'll be a little clearer. So now I'm going to hop into the misdemeanor charges that volunteers faced. So to start, this is a map of southern Arizona, specifically what we refer to as the West Desert. It's a lot of public land. It's a lot of wilderness. The red circle kind of shows the area that we're going to focus on. It's the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, which is where volunteers were charged, thus the name Cabeza 9. It's north and west of Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, which is a national park. And then north of both of those places is the Barry M. Goldwater Military Range, which is an active bombing range. I mentioned earlier the border enforcement strategy of prevention through deterrence, which walls off urban areas to route people into more rural, remote settings. Another piece of that is interior Border Patrol checkpoints. And so on every paved road leaving the borderlands, there are Border Patrol checkpoints where people are pulled over and questioned about their citizenship status before being allowed to continue north. And so in this area, there's 2 checkpoints, one just north of Sonoita and one just north of Ajo. And so what that has done is it has intentionally funneled people into the wilderness and then also onto an active military bombing range. People are walking in an area where the Air Force is actively doing target practice with bombs. We've spoken to people who have crossed through this area. We know people who have received emergency calls from people that have walked up on towns built out of foam where there's mosques. And those are towns that the military builds to use as target practice. And so that's kind of the context of that area. And what that means for migrant deaths is that there are just an absurd amount of people who have died and disappeared in this region. And again, these are the known deaths. The bombing range doesn't have any public access, so you and I can't actually go out there. So there's a lot of, I believe there's a lot of people out there that have died and never been found. And then a lot of the area that we do have public access to, it's all wilderness areas that are extremely remote, where you need to hike sometimes overnight to even get into some of these areas. And this is also some of the hottest areas of the desert. So in the summer, the average highs every day are about 110. I've also done overnight hikes in this area in the winter where all of our water froze overnight. So there's a really extreme fluctuation in temperature. And there's no natural water out there. And because it's wilderness, there's also nowhere to seek help. So we expanded into the Cabeza Prieta wilderness in 2015. We were started in 2004, but didn't have the capacity to get out there till later. And we started doing a lot of really long hikes and finding literal military shrapnel, so unexploded bombs. This kind of weird thing that looks like a paper airplane is called a tow dart. It's about 12 feet long. They tow them behind aircraft and use them for target practice. And the whole desert is completely littered with those. And then we also started finding a lot of remains of people who had died, some recent, some old. Often we'll just find some bones. But we knew that we needed to do more work in that area. And so we really amped up our presence out there. And to go onto the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, because it was a bombing range, you need to get a visitor permit and sign a disclaimer that you won't touch any of the unexploded ordinances, and that if you do and you get injured or you die, that you won't sue the government. And so whenever we went out there, we had to sign that paperwork. And in 2017, they updated their paperwork. They added a clause that said abandonment of personal property. It's highlighted in yellow. And they basically said, I agree to remove all personal property and possessions, including but not limited to objects, debris, water bottles, water containers, food items, food containers, blankets, clothing, footwear, medical supplies. And if you'll remember back to when I talked about water drops, these are all the supplies that we leave. These are all potentially life-saving supplies that we put in areas where a lot of people have died in order to prevent loss of life. And their new permitting language specifically targeted our organization to attempt to prevent us from being out there. We continued our work because we believe really strongly in what we're doing. And I think all of us that have found the bodies of people who have died or run into people in distress in the desert, I think the potential, at the time we didn't know what the potential legal risks could be, but I think we understood the situation and the potential loss of life versus our own legal risk. I think was a risk a lot of people were able and willing to take. A lot of our volunteers hold a lot of privileges like citizenship and different things like that, and so I think a lot of people made their own decisions. And so in December, 9 volunteers were charged with various misdemeanors, and they were all charged for activities that had happened over the summer. And the interesting thing here is that a lot of those volunteers didn't actually live in Arizona. And so they had fish and wildlife officers showing up at their doors in Bellingham, Washington, in New Orleans, and Ohio. And they were served summons to come and be charged. They were charged with abandonment of property, entering a wildlife refuge without a permit, and then operating a motor vehicle in a wilderness area. So with the operating a motor vehicle, I want to clarify that it's not like driving off-road wherever, which is definitely something that Border Patrol and law enforcement do in that area. But there are also a series of administrative roads that are maintained and driven by archaeologists and different people. And so volunteers were driving on those administrative roads. To also give a little more context about where volunteers were when they interacted with law enforcement and then were subsequently charged. So this is a map of the known migrant deaths in the West Desert. And this blue pin is where people were charged. It's about 50 or 60 miles north of the border. So a 3 to 7 day walk, depending on the route. But we, as well as other organizations in Southern Arizona, had started referring to this area as the Trail of Death, because every year there consistently was a series of recoveries just right in that area. And to get in there, you have to hike probably 5 to 10 miles. And so by driving on the administrative roads, we were trying to get as much access as possible. But of course, our volunteers were then charged. So in 2019, we went to trial for the Cabeza folks twice, once for the first group and then once for Dr. Scott Warren. And these trials were, they were bench trials, so there's no jury, just a judge. But they were really stark. I remember hearing a lot of, they had the head ranger of the wildlife refuge, as well as a regional director for U.S. Fish and Wildlife were on the stand, and they were asked if they knew how many people had died on the land that they managed, and they consistently said that they had no idea. And so the people that are, tasked with maintaining safety and that land just had no idea that every year there were consistently dozens of people dying out there. And I say didn't know. I think they did know, but they weren't willing to admit it. And it's not a priority of theirs. I guess real quick, also, I want to go back and throw a little bit of shade at the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. So this is a national park where over 250 remains of people have been found, but they're the only national park that doesn't report fatalities on the national park website. And I've seen some of the nastier things that I've seen by law enforcement have been park rangers. For border wall construction, there were a lot of Kiachet Atam people and allies resisting wall construction out there around sacred sites. And there's video footage taken of Border Patrol as well as National Park Rangers just punching people in the face to get them to leave and get out of the way of the construction equipment. And so it's definitely not just Cabeza Prieta. I think all of the land managers in the West Desert are extremely complicit and responsible for this level of death and suffering. But during the Cabeza trials, that became even more clear than we'd seen before by just them saying that they had no idea how many people had died out on that land. For these trials, we used a religious freedoms claim to defend our volunteers, and that was under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. RFRA was actually, it was signed into law by the Clinton administration, and it actually came about in response to a case in Oregon where 2 men were fired from their jobs for testing positive on a drug test for peyote. They were both Indigenous men and had been using it for ceremonial purposes, and they were denied unemployment. And so the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, was meant to protect smaller religions in practicing their spirituality and religion. And it can be brought in, and I think it's more well known for the Hobby Lobby cases. It kind of was appropriated by the Christian right and has been used by Hobby Lobby, as well as I believe a cake maker in Colorado who didn't want to make a cake for a same-sex couple. And RFRA can be brought affirmatively, or it can be used as a defense. So we used it as a defense, and it has three parts. Basically, first, the defendant or plaintiff needs to establish that what you're doing is part of your religious, you're doing it because of your deeply held spiritual or religious belief. In the Ninth Circuit, that doesn't need to be part of an organized religion. It can just be a spiritual belief that kind of occupies the place of a religion. And then you need to establish that what the government is doing inhibits you from practicing your beliefs. So we had to establish that our volunteers were leaving food and water, were driving on administrative roads, and entering without a permit as part of their deeply held spiritual practice. And that the government criminalizing this and charging the volunteers inhibited that practice. We were able to establish that, which then flips the responsibility, and then the government must prove that it has a compelling interest to enforce the law in a way that violates your beliefs, mostly because to try to enforce it any other way would be unduly burdensome. And there's some other pieces about how they need to use the least restrictive means possible, and many other pieces of that. And if you would like to learn more, I highly recommend this paper written by, or this document by the Columbia Law School Law, Rights, and Religion Project. It kind of talks about how RFRA has been appropriated by the Christian right, but how actually there's a lot of uses that do have a purpose, and that it can be an important thing. I definitely think that a lot of us felt a little confused and unsure about using this. Not all of our volunteers identify as spiritual or religious. And so it's not a way to fully protect all of our work. It more works for individuals, although we are a ministry of the Unitarian Universalist Church. We don't have any like religious or spiritual requirements to participate in our work. But I definitely recommend looking up more if you're interested through the Columbia Law School. But what was interesting about, so under RFRA, we had convictions reversed, and then we also had charges dropped. And part of the wild part that happened, or the kind of interesting part to a lot of us, was that a federal judge reversed the conviction, but also talked about what the government's compelling interest was to prevent people from providing humanitarian aid in that area. And it kind of goes back to the prevention through deterrence by death strategy that they use. But the judge says this: the government seems to rely on a deterrence theory, reasoning that preventing clean water and food from being placed on the refuge would increase the risk of death or extreme illness for those seeking to cross unlawfully, which in turn would discourage or deter people from attempting to enter without authorization. In other words, the government claims a compelling interest in preventing defendants from interfering with a border enforcement strategy of deterrence by death. This gruesome logic is profoundly disturbing. And I think what we all, it's also speculative and unsupported by evidence. So I think we were really happy to get this reversal that also kind of helped set future precedent, and did also, I think, pressure the prosecutors to drop the one final pending charge that Dr. Scott Warren still had. But I think part of what we wanted to do going into all the trials was, our volunteers were on trial, but we wanted to put the border crisis and the government more on trial, and really highlight just how intentional this crisis has been at every turn, and just the level of negligence and violence that's happening. And so I definitely encourage people to read more if they want. Also, I have a couple screenshots in here of news articles, and a lot of them are from The Intercept. Ryan Devereaux is a reporter at The Intercept who did really extensive reporting on all of the trials, and I highly recommend looking up his work if people want more info. He also links to a lot of the motions and filings, which you can, of course, find on Pacer, but they're all up there for free as well. So that's kind of all of the criminalization. Sorry, I'm running out of time, but really quickly, I'll just touch on the COVID-19 pandemic, which has absolutely affected our work. Since the start of the pandemic, people aren't getting formally deported when they're picked up in the field. They are under Title 42, they're expelled. And so it's essentially a rapid deportation where people don't go through any, they don't go through court, which is positive because it's, you know, we don't want people to be charged with things, but they often don't receive medical care if they're in need of it. They just get dropped off at the nearest port of entry. With COVID, we've also seen worsening conditions in detention centers and a lot of COVID outbreaks in ICE facilities. And so we've shifted a lot of our work, especially with our legal clinic, to have a bond fund and try to get as many people out of custody as possible, as fast as possible. So if you're interested, you can check out our website and donate to our bond fund. We also had to come up with COVID protocols for volunteers. So we limited the number of volunteers. We implemented full masking in all of our aid stations, as well as when we're out on water drops with anybody that's not in their immediate household, and a ton of other things, but just to say that it has absolutely affected our work. In the past year, also post criminal charges and trials, we've had multiple raids at one of our main humanitarian aid stations called Bird Camp. And those raids were facilitated by BORTAC. People might be familiar with BORTAC. They're the agency that was also pulling people off the street in Portland at Black Lives Matter marches and detaining them. They basically descended on our camp on 2 different occasions in July and October of last year, fully armed with a helicopter. They detained volunteers and then arrested over 50 or detained over 50 migrants. And I think the important thing here to note is that volunteers were detained but not charged. And so, you know, I think we're happy that we were able to prove that humanitarian aid is never a crime, but the root of the border crisis is that migration is criminalized. And if we're not able to decriminalize migration, I don't think that we'll ever actually be able to, you know, fulfill our mission as an organization. It's absolutely not about our volunteers facing charges. It's about the government kind of, you know, escalating their repression tactics that they've employed against undocumented people for decades, really. And the targeting of aid workers was an escalation of that. And it also was not in isolation. There were organizers across the country that were also targeted for speaking out against ICE. It was very much a pattern under the Trump administration. But yeah, the raids were pretty violent, and all of the volunteer phones were seized. And so there's very little documentation that we have of what actually occurred during those raids, but they were pretty violent experiences for everybody involved. Post raids, just this last month, we also released part 3 of the Disappeared report series called Left to Die, Border Patrol Search and Rescue and the Crisis of Disappearance. And this, again, is talking about the 911 discriminatory system, of how the counties have, the counties are not set up to handle the level of crisis that Border Patrol has created through their enforcement tactics. So there's a huge, massive missing persons crisis and a lot of distress calls that come in to the counties. And they pass off those calls, if they're perceived to be border crossers, to Border Patrol. And then Border Patrol mostly doesn't respond. Sometimes we'll send one person to look for an hour. And they also interfere with humanitarian aid and family efforts to locate disappeared persons. And so I highly recommend folks check out that report. It's really well written, it's really long, but it includes a lot of firsthand accounts and stories. I feel like we always get the question of what's next, what's up with Biden? You know, I think we've already seen he's still caging children. They're calling it overflow factories now. The Democrats have always had a different marketing and messaging strategy around this, but the origins of the border crisis of death and disappearance are with a Democratic president. It all started under Clinton and was also expanded under Obama. I don't want to ever let people believe that it's just a Trump issue, because the targeting of undocumented people is a long-standing thing, and the enforcing the border is also a bipartisan issue. You know, Trump was very focused on the wall. Democrats have always been more focused on a virtual wall, but it comes with the same problems. It still pushes people into more remote terrain, makes it more dangerous, and all of the things that we spoke about before. But yeah, I guess this is, you know, it's nice to end on a hopeful note, but I don't know that I actually can do that sincerely, just based on what we've seen so far. Especially this Biden also deports hashtag we've also seen used by a lot of Black immigrant groups. And so I think people should definitely check out a lot of those organizations, because immigration is often not seen as a Black issue, but a lot of the deportations that have been happening under Biden were to Cameroon, Haiti, and different places, and they were majority Black immigrants. If you're interested in more, we are all over social media and also have a website. Feel free to follow us for updates on our work and ways to get involved. I think I also encourage people, if you're not in the borderlands or able to come out here, we have a volunteer program, but also people doing deportation prevention work and supporting undocumented people in your own community, I view as equally valid and important as the work that we do, because the border just affects people everywhere. But feel free to follow us on social media and then check out our website. We also send out like a newsletter and e-blasts, and you can subscribe to those on our website. Yeah, that is all I have.
Thank you so much. That was really illuminating. Some of that was hard to watch. I'd like to ask you some questions from our attendees. Thank you for this presentation. Your organization is doing such incredible work. I am wondering if there are any ways for us in Oregon to help.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually reached out, one of my friends was working in Oregon on a bunch of the ballot initiatives for driver's licenses for people, and I'm excited that that passed a few years ago, but I think anything that supports farm workers and undocumented people in your community is great. I don't have a solid list of organizations in Oregon. I know I've heard of like Cabeza and Pecun are a couple that I have heard of, but yeah, just doing anti-deportation work and supporting farm workers are ways that people can support, especially now that there's Democrats back in office. During the Obama years, Obama deported about 2 million people. And so a lot of the folks we were meeting in the desert had been deported from the interior. And so very much if you're able to stop deportations, that is stopping people from having to walk in the desert. And that is really, really important harm reduction, preventative work. I know there's also a lot of work to shut down the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. And so that is also really key work, as well as just kind of the wider defunding law enforcement movement. I think there's a lot of overlap between defunding law enforcement and defunding ICE and Border Patrol. There's a ton of overlap there. So find out whatever is active in your community and get involved with that.
Thank you. I have another question that says, do you know how and if they have been able to find the missing parents of the children that have been or are being caged? Is there an effort to find the undocumented parents?
I think there is, and I think a lot of it is being done by lawyers. I recently saw an article that was a bunch of lawyers were helping find kind of reunite family members. But, I think it really speaks volumes that when the government started separating children from their parents, they didn't create a tracking system of how to eventually reunite them. And I think just the level of negligence and not thinking through these things and the harm that's going to be caused, to me really fits with the deterrence by death kind of strategy that they've had for years. And family separation very much aligns with that as well. If a family crosses the border and they get separated and they tell, the theory is that if they tell their community back home that happened, that then it'll prevent other people from coming. And again, I think that hasn't been the case. But I don't know of specific resources that other people could plug into. I've just kind of read a few articles here and there.
All right, thank you. I would encourage people to send any additional questions that they may have. We still have a little bit of time. In the meantime, I was curious, we've been talking a lot about the executive branch. Have you seen any moves from Congress in response to these events?
So in response to like stuff along the border, or what kind of? Oh, you're on mute.
The legal battles that have resulted from your humanitarian aid work, as well as some of the publicity and public outcry that's happened in response to your work and the government's response?
Yeah, there was, at one point there was a letter that a bunch of Congress folks signed on to demanding that the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Arizona drop the charges against Scott Warren. I know also in the past year, there's been some legislation about like missing persons in the desert and having different ways to document and calculate how many people have died and try to identify and repatriate remains. I don't know a ton of details about that, and I think it also included funding for Border Patrol. And so, I think a lot of us were a little skeptical about that when we see a solution that gives more money to the agency that's responsible for a crisis to try to mitigate something, a little hesitant there. But we also talked about if we wanted to try to push for legislation that's kind of reaffirming that humanitarian aid is never a crime. And I think we kind of came to the conclusion that we didn't really want to put all of our time into something that was just about us as humanitarian aid workers. We wanted to push more along the lines of defunding CBP. There's a campaign called the Defund Hate campaign that we have stood behind. But I think we are, as a group, I think a lot of us are a little skeptical of the process and just how also potentially defining something as humanitarian aid and not a crime creates categories of who is an aid worker and who isn't, because there are a lot of people that live in the borderlands that care for people who show up at their back door that maybe aren't part of a formal group, but are definitely providing humanitarian aid. And so any legislation around who is and isn't an aid worker, I think gets really complicated and tricky. And we weren't sure if there'd be a potential for it causing harm.
It's really interesting. We've got a new question. Has anyone yet emerged in the Biden administration that could be a champion for this work and could be a focus for moving forward?
I think I haven't been tracking it as well as I could have been. I think we, as an org, generally focus so much on our direct aid work that we don't keep as close of tabs on what's happening in DC. Obviously, it does deeply affect our work, but it's not our focus and it's not how we approach the crisis. We're more interested in how do we get water out there tomorrow. But I would look at Detention Watch Network, I think has really good resources, and they're definitely keeping tabs on who are potentially movable in DC to cut funding and to change policy. So I would definitely look at them and see if they have people.
I was also very curious watching that video of the Border Patrol agents sabotaging your aid work. Is it legal for them to do that?
Yeah, there's no reason why they can't do that. In fact, I mean, yeah, like we were criminalized for putting water out. And so, yeah, there's no law that says you can't vandalize aid supplies. That main agent it's not a trail cam, it's somebody filming, and he's like dumping out the water. He's like, get a good shot. He actually got a promotion and got transferred to Texas. So his name is Agent Kermis. But there's definitely not any consequences. I think I'd also like to share, I mentioned the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, so part of the national park. We've also had national park rangers remove our water, and yeah, they just go out and maybe they don't cut the gallons, they dump them out and take it out because they consider it litter. But I've had that occur within like 100 feet of the body of a man that we found that had recently died. And the park rangers were tasked with recovering this man's body. And instead they went and hiked about a mile and dumped all of our water gallons out, hiked them back to their car, and let his body just lay in the sun for hours. So You know, I think the construct of criminality in this country is not based on morals and ethics. It's based on, did you break a rule or did you not break a rule? And so I think that was a thing that we kind of ran up against a lot during trials was, you know, we're just like, how is this a crime? And it's like, well, like the US code is not written to be like nonviolent and caring for people. It's written to maintain order and do specific things. And our work in many ways does undermine the US border enforcement policy because the policy is deterrence by death. And so by lessening that, we arguably are making Border Patrol less effective.
Well, thank you so much for coming out here and speaking to us. And thank you everyone for coming, everyone attending. Yeah, we're going to be continuing to run PILC panels throughout this week. This evening, we have one on wildlife poaching and another one on the protection of native bees. So be sure to check our social media to see what events we have upcoming and make sure to keep tabs on No More Death and all of the initiatives that they're putting forward. With that, oh, we have another question. So I'm going to ask you that since we still have time, if that's all right. Is there any effort to stop the harm of drug cartels in Mexico and California? There are cities in California that are now run by cartels. I have developed classes for migrants and know the cartel problems. That's the question.
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, there's, I think it's an interesting question because I think here we need to also look at the origins of the cartels in Mexico and California. So in Mexico specifically, you know, and along the border. So part of that prevention through deterrence policy stated also that one of the desired outcomes and indicators of success wouldn't just be deaths, but it would also be an increase in smuggler fees. And so in doing that, you know, there's supply and demand. If you make something more difficult, it makes it more expensive. And what used to really be run by kind of mom and pop folks that lived along the border has been completely taken over by the cartels as a result of border militarization. I think also just looking at the US, like how the US is complicit in the origin of some of the cartels. There's a couple that, you know, broke off from the Mexican military who were trained in the United States and given guns by the US government. So, you know, I think there's a lot of harm that has been caused by the drug cartels. I absolutely don't want to minimize that. And I feel skeptical of solutions that are more militarization, more policing and all of that, because I think a lot of these are born out of poverty and then also US training and US guns. So it's a kind of tricky question, but I think it's hard for me to be like, oh, it's the Mexican drug cartel issue without looking at the way that the US is also involved in training and also arming those groups. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah, very informative. If no one else has any questions, then I believe we're ready to close out this panel. But again, I'd like to thank everyone who showed up and participated, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Goodbye.